Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Travel Massive podcast. My name's Jean. I'm chapter leader from Melbourne. I'm also a blogger, and I am a newbie podcaster, which is really exciting for me. I've done that thing like so many other people in isolation life, and I've started a freaking podcast. And today I'm joined by Amanda Kendle, who is one of our Perth chapter leaders, has been in the travel content creation industry for longer than either of us would like to remember.
That's true. It makes me feel old. Stop it.
No, we're not that old. It's fine. So back to podcast reality. So welcome everybody to our ridiculous chat. This is pretty much what it's going to be like for the rest of the evening. We're going to go for about 45 minutes here, give or take. If you'd like to ask a question, please do let us know. You can ask a question on Facebook if you're watching us this evening from Facebook. That'll pop up here in our stream, and Amanda and I can answer things live. Or if you are joining us from the Travel Massive platform, if you use the chat box, I'll be monitoring. So if you see me doing weird stuff like this, I'm not avoiding Amanda or giving her weird wine-fueled signals. It's just me checking in on all of the chat happenings today. So as I did mention previously before, Amanda has been in the travel content creation space for a reasonable amount of time. She's really experienced, everybody. I think that's probably the nicest way to put it. But the reason we've got Amanda on here today is not only am I just pimping out my friends here, also Amanda is the thoughts, the inspiration, and more importantly, the voice behind the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Now, Amanda, we're just chatting before. You've been doing this for 4 years now, and you've got 191 episodes. You're getting really close to the 200, which is amazing. You've just started a second podcast, and there was rumours potentially of a third. But tell me more about your second podcast and introduce yourself to everybody.
Well, thanks, Jean. Yes, and hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I can see on the chat things on my other screen, people are coming in from all around the globe, which is kind of exciting. So thanks for joining us. And I promise not to interrupt you again, Jean, too much. I'll try. Oh, maybe I shouldn't promise. So, yes, I've been running the Thoughtful Travel podcast for 4 years, and during that time, I've realised that there's a gap in the market for travel podcasts for kids as well. So I have a 10-year-old son, and over the years, he's been listening, to so many podcasts, and to many podcasts so many times, because there's not many podcasts out there that are great for kids. There's not really much that kind of covers his kind of zone of genius, which is travel, culture, geography. And so he and I decided that it would be time to start a new podcast because, I've got time. And so we've got our trailer episode up, and we're about to launch our first few episodes imminently. It's called Taking Off. So if you are a listener with kids, probably between the ages of about 6 and 11 or so, then Taking Off might be something that they will enjoy.
Oh, that's awesome. How did you go when you were sort of deciding to name that one? Like, totally off topic here, because we really are today talking about nurturing a community, whether it's your existing community or finding a new community with your podcast. But I'm just really fascinated with how you and Mr. 10 decided to come up with this name for a podcast.
Oh, well, Jean, I can do one better. I can segue right back to our topic, because what I did was go to my existing community. I really did. So I talked about it to my community of, I have a Facebook group called Thoughtful Travelers, who are listeners of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. And I knew in there that there were plenty of people who were parents. And so I said, hey, are there any of you who would like to be part of a small group to help us with Taking Off? It wasn't called Taking Off then, to help us with like the idea for a kids podcast. And so I have probably a dozen or so people who put their hand up to say, yes, I'd love to help. I've got kids this kind of age. And so together we brainstormed, and also got a few friends, quote unquote, real life friends involved. And between all of those thoughts, it came out that Taking Off was a popular kind of name for it. It had to be something memorable, vaguely related to travel, but fun enough for kids to kind of remember it and want to listen and say, hey, Mum, can I listen to Taking Off tonight? So hopefully soon there's thousands of kids around the world asking their mum that exact question.
I love it that you've just tapped into your community and crowdsourced a name for your podcast. Like, it's just fantastic. It's really taking advantage of the trust that you've already got there with your community members. Because, like, for me, like, I've just started a podcast, and naming it, I felt like I was naming my firstborn child, which I don't even have yet. It was such a pinnacle moment before starting to register, doing all the tech stuff, was, what do I actually call this? How will this be relevant to my community? And, you know, where do I get this from? And, you know, I have to say a huge public thank you to you for your mentoring along the way and all those annoying questions when I was asking you for the tech help about it. We're not going to cover that in today's session. We have recently on Travel Massive Live done how to start a podcast and some of the tech behind it. So if anyone's curious about that, you can just pop back. Those are all live on the Travel Massive platform at the moment. But today I really just want to deep dive into the podcast community. Like, for me, when I was thinking about starting a podcast, I really wanted to continue with my existing community and really engage with them on a very different platform. But I think it was probably 2 years ago when I first floated this idea with you that maybe I wanted to do it, and you were 110% behind me. Just do it, Jean, just start it. And I'm a little bit slow, so here we are today. But when people come to you and ask you, as an experienced podcaster, as someone who's been around and has tested a lot of the rough patches on the podcasting road, what's some of the pros and cons, do you think, for people who are thinking about starting their podcast?
Well, I'll start with the con, because there's really only one big con, and that is that it's pretty time consuming. It is not, I mean, you know, with all kinds of content creation, it's time consuming, but I think that podcasting is a special kind of time consuming. And typically people end up doing a lot of the tech themselves because of the cost factor, and learning that can be pretty time consuming as well. And just, you know, if you want to be consistent and keep that up every week, keep up an episode every week or so, which is, you know, what I always aim to do, it takes a fair bit of time. I've managed to kind of shave that time down quite dramatically over the years because I've got used to it. I've got lots of processes and it's easier, but big con. Fortunately, there are so many pros that that outweighs it definitely for me, and that's why I'm still doing it more than 4 years in. So it's a lot of fun. I mean, I get to spend time talking to people who are all over the world doing awesome things, and they're so keen to share their stories with me. Like, I never have to twist anyone's arm to come on my podcast. They're always keen to, you know, they're always happy to talk. And I guess because my podcast topics are quite wide ranging, being thoughtful travel, it can be, you know, kind of any way that, you know, any story about travel that's had an impact in all kinds of ways. So I get to talk to a really big variety of people. And, you know, that is just pure fun. Like, I enjoy it. And often we'll, you know, have half an hour or so to record, and we'll end up still be talking 2 hours later because, you know, these strangers, people who were strangers, you know, 2 hours earlier, have suddenly become good friends. So the people that I've got to meet, that's awesome fun. And without meaning to sound like I'm really, you know, shoehorning it right into your topic, Jean, but the community that I have gathered around my podcast is by far the most exciting part about it. I didn't really know how that would work. As a blogger, I didn't really, I mean, I knew my audience and I had some followers who I would know and interact with, but I think it's at a different level when you have a podcast because you are in their ears. They are listening to you and your guests, but especially, you know, every week to me, just blather on, you know, and I'm in their ears when they're, you know, exercising or at the gym.
You and the dogs and I go for a walk every week.
Absolutely.
You know, it's a very personal connection that you have. Like,
yes.
you and I know each other in real life. You know, we've met along the road, and you've come to Melbourne. One day when borders open, I'll come to Perth. And that's, you know, I know it's a very different connection for you and I because we have that personal connection. But I feel like that's just grown more because every week you're with me while I'm doing stuff. Good days, bad days, rainy days. Like today, freezing cold weather. Thanks, Melbourne.
Sorry,
but
I hope I've warmed you a bit.
But it's just this, it's such an innate way to connect with somebody without actually being there. Like, I don't have to make time to call you for the podcast. It's just there. It's on my phone. It's such a convenient way to hear you and to listen to what other people are doing.
Yeah. It's a medium that's quite different to all the others, I think. And because it's when you need it, it's not even, it's better even than radio, because it's ready at the moment that you are ready to go for a walk with your dogs, or to clean the house, or to commute, or whatever. You can hit play and there you are. So I often joke that I wish I could get some benefit of all the calories that people have used up by walking or jogging to my podcast. If I could just have 1% of those, I'd be the fittest person on earth. So obviously that's a shame. But because of that,
we can dream.
like,
We can
personal
dream.
connection. Well, I'm dreaming. But because of that personal connection, then I think when people come to me, like in the Facebook group especially, is where they'll usually come and chat to me. They're so friendly straight away because they think they know me. I mean, they do in a sense know me, I suppose. They know podcast me, and they know lots of my stories. And, often I'll meet people in real life who have listened to the podcast, and they'll say something to me about something that's happened to me in the past. And I'm shocked that they would know. And then I think, oh, I must have said that on the podcast at some stage. But, over 4 years of just inserting my little stories throughout, I really have no clue what's in there anymore. That's a lot of episodes and a lot of little anecdotes. And I don't know which ones I've told sometimes. So, it's a really personal connection. And I think also the nature of the content and the topic of my podcast means that people who are drawn to it are very like-minded. Like, they're very diverse. I have listeners of all age groups and all nationalities all around the world. So they're very diverse in that sense, but they're very like-minded in that they love to travel, and they love to, at least give some thought to how they travel and what they've got out of it, and how they might be able to travel better and all of that. So the conversations we have in that group are just so fabulous. I love it.
It is a fantastic group. If anyone's out there is looking for another group, Amanda's got some fabulous people. I'm not going to lie, I've had people in that group help me out when I've been in pickle around the world. You just pop up a question, does anybody know where I can go, where I can get this, what I should do? And it's a fantastic community to be within. It's very similar to sort of the Travel Massive community and the chapter pages, of just having like-minded people having great discussions. So when you decided you're going to start this podcast, you already have a really solid blog community. Were you a bit concerned about tapping into that community and either taking away traffic from your website, where a lot of us content creators have previously monetized through traffic to websites, or were you concerned that you would alienate some of them because it's you and it's your Australian accent too? Like, I have the same issue. Sometimes it's just a little bit different for people to hear.
Yes. So I was really curious because I suspected that my blog readers were probably a different audience to my future podcast listeners, people who prefer to read versus people who prefer to listen. And I would actually largely say that on the whole, that turned out to be true. So, of course, there's some crossover, and there's people who have been reading my blog for years who now listen to the podcast. But and of course, I used that audience when I first launched my podcast. But I would definitely say, if I could really break it down, that probably 3/4 of my listeners are new to me because of the podcast, and they didn't come from my existing audience. However, in the early days, it was, the best way to get a start and to get some listeners in, and to get some guests as well. So a lot of my early guests came through my connections from my travel blog. So kind of, it all fed into each other. Each bit fed into the other and kind of worked out. But in terms of alienating the audience, or kind of splitting it across the blog and the podcast, I think, largely they have become two separate things. And some of my podcast listeners will now read some of my blog posts who wouldn't have before. But I feel like largely
just
speaking,
like a minimal crossover.
Yeah, I think so. There's certainly there's a core who will listen and read, but more broadly speaking, there's the readers and there's the listeners.
Nice. So it's so interesting when you sort of talk about how there is that crossover, and some people really like to listen and some people really like to read. And I know in the last few years for me, it's more so on podcast because it's a convenience thing for me. I love reading people's blogs, and when I'm doing research, I read a lot. But day to day, I find I just don't have that much time to do that. But when I'm doing stuff like the housework, walking the dogs, or commuting places, it's just such an easy medium. So if anyone's out there is wondering, should you start a podcast? Amanda and I are saying yes.
There is
It's
still
hard
plenty
work,
of space.
but yes, don't listen to the ABC who said not to do it, because that was ridiculous.
No. They were just joking.
They were very much joking, because they all have podcasts, successful
Exactly.
podcasts right now. So when you've tapped into your existing community, trying to get us back on track here, it's a bit difficult.
I know, well
some days.
done.
Very well done, Jean. I'm proud of you. You're tapping into your existing community. You're starting to set things up, and things are flowing really nicely. For instance, I've been a guest on your podcast and have had a lot of fun. I know a lot of our other travel friends have as well. At what point do you go, I need to nurture a new community, and I'm going to start a Facebook group?
It's such a good question as you were saying that, I was thinking, gosh, when did I start the group? And of course, now you've asked me directly. So I honestly can't remember. I would say it was probably a year or so in, I think. Gosh, I'd be curious to go back and check. It certainly wasn't immediately. I don't think I wanted to immediately. And, getting the podcast itself up every week in the early days was enough of a challenge. So I think I was perhaps less focused on audience building and community building in those, especially first sort of 6 to 9 months. But at some stage, I would have people who, I guess they were trying to get in touch with me, and they would comment maybe on Twitter or on a Facebook post or whatever. And I realized that these were my podcast people, and decided to start Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group to kind of connect with them there. And it was definitely the right decision, and grew from there to be, a crowd of fabulous people who I would love to. I always tell them my dream is to win like the most massive lotto win ever and fly everyone I can find to one place somewhere, and we can have a big Thoughtful Travel podcast party, because I feel like I would love to. Just go to New Zealand?
Yeah, well, I'll just go to New Zealand. It's beautiful.
Okay, all right.
They've got good wine. Like, if you're going to go somewhere, why not? If anyone else has suggestions on where Amanda, when she wins like 20 million, can take all of her Thoughtful Traveller group, let us know. Facebook, Travel Massive, comments.
I'm open to anything.
Could do Tasmania.
And sponsorship too.
Well.
Anyone who wants to sponsor that little party, a big party.
Yeah, in case we forget to buy the Tats Lotto ticket and don't win it again.
Yeah,
so
it's a problem.
You've dropped the S word, sponsorship. How did you go about doing sponsorship on your podcast? And do you think that was, this is a double-edged question, a good thing for your community or a bad thing? And were you really keen to kind of keep sponsorship really on brand? I know, like when I do the travel blog, I'm super fussy. I really do kind of deep dive into brand values, product development, where it's manufactured. There's quite a lot that goes in before I agree to work with a brand. And for me, I'm hoping that will eventually flow through on my podcast, or people can just tune in and listen to me rant like they are right now. But I'm really just concerned that, going down that sponsorship or that advertising could be detrimental to the community and could have a negative. How did you find all of that complex?
Yes, so it's a lot to navigate, and I thought about it a lot before I did it. And because I'm a listener to so many other podcasts, I kind of observed what I liked and disliked about the way they did it. So, for example, one thing I hate is any ads read by other people, or really interruptive ads, the kind like a typical TV ad. They were so disruptive to me, and I would just click fast forward, skip 15 however many times to get through those on other podcasts. So that was something I definitely didn't want to do, because I couldn't see the value for a sponsor either when people are just going to skip the ads. So I didn't want to do it that way. So like you said, I was very selective about sponsors, and definitely had to make sure they matched my values, as well as, that I would assume they're a good match with my listeners. And I've always done host read ads. So in fact, not even host read ads, host written ads. So I would talk to the sponsors about the product or the service, and I would say, okay, well, I'll write, something about, like, either I would experience or I would tie their product into something that I'd done and tell an anecdote that connected to that or something like that. So
really
that it was still
organic
interesting.
approach.
Super organic and still interesting, because basically my goal was that my listeners would still find it interesting to listen to and they wouldn't skip it, because then that's value for the sponsor, and it's not annoying for the listeners to think that there's something they want to skip either. So that's kind of the way that I've always approached it. And I've had a really good feedback from listeners. So
that was going to be my next question. Has anyone clapped back or Karened at you and said that, they're unsubscribing because you've just given in to the money man?
No, not at all. I had quite the opposite. I had quite a lot of people who would who messaged me and said things like, "Oh, I really like the way you run sponsors," because they understand that I need to make money. That I'm not, I haven't won lotto, so
we haven't bought those tickets yet, Amanda. We've got to work on that.
This is part of the problem, I suppose. But yeah, they understood that that's part of how it works, and they appreciated that I do it in a fairly, in as transparent and authentic, overused word, but as way as possible. So that's kind of how it works. I do on my podcast. I do have end roll ads that are host supplied, and they are different. That's more like Google ads, so they're different for everyone. Wherever whoever's listening will get a different one, but they're after the end of my podcast, and I find that is okay, unoffensive. No one's ever complained about it, that's for sure. And
do you ever listen to them just for the funds? Like sit around, see what's going?
I should. I haven't for a long time, not since the very early days. Good point. Noted. I will do that again soon. I don't even listen to my outro. Like, I'm like, okay, skip. So I know what I say at the end. I only like to re-listen back to my guests. But so yeah, no. But yeah, and I find that that's kind of a non-offensive way to do it. I hope no one's ever complained, and is another income stream. So it's important to have some income streams here.
So you're saying it's very important to diversify your income streams.
Isn't it just 100%?
Going to say that again, everyone out there, diversifying your income streams is very important, because you don't know when a global pandemic will hit.
Absolutely, yes, 1,000% right.
For you, when you start to look at all of these things, building your community, nurturing your community, not wanting to offend your community with sponsorship or mismessages, what are some things that are just a no-go for you whatsoever? Things that you're like, I'm just never going to do that, because your community is not going to go really well. Like for me, it'd be animal experiences would not go down well with my community, or decaf coffee.
Well, I don't mind what my listeners drink, but definitely like the values of those kinds of things, like animal, responsible tourism is something that I bang on about quite a lot, and more over the years. So I wouldn't, I don't think I would even interview someone who was going to talk about something that wasn't, that didn't match my values. And if they by chance told a story, say they had been elephant riding, I wouldn't include that. There's no way I would include that. So it has to fit the values that I think me and the community share. That's not to say that I wouldn't discuss things like that. Definitely would discuss pros and cons of, maybe not that, but other grayer areas. And I don't know. I think my audience are fairly sophisticated and mature and pretty good. I don't know. I'm not, but maybe they are.
I want to know how many of them are in here at the moment going, yes, we are. We're adults.
Yes, but they're pretty good at having a good, polite, robust discussion. I can count on one hand the time that I've thought discussion has got a little heated in the group, and it's never got more than a little heated, and that's only about really difficult issues. So I think I don't know, maybe because I model it, I hope, then there's a quite high level of respect of each other in the group. Like, I'm very aware of, I guess I try really hard to be correct and upstanding, I suppose, to
leading
kind of have
by
that,
example.
Yeah, well, to lead by example, and we're very diverse, and this is what I would do, and I would like you to think about this. That kind of, everyone has a right to their own opinion, kind of stuff. The other thing that is in my podcast, there's no swearing, because I recognized early on that people like my son love to listen to it, and so I wanted to be a podcast that could be played in a family situation, because, my son loves listening to it, and he's only 10, and even when he was sort of 7 or 8, he would love to listen to it, and not just for me. He'll in fact, he probably would be happy to skip over the bits of me. He actually, also enjoys what the guests talk about. So I recognize that you didn't have to be an adult to to actually get something out of it. So that was, important to me, that it could play in the car with kids in the back seat, and you wouldn't have to kind of,
which my podcast is not. I'm just going to put that out
which is
there. My
absolutely
podcast
fine.
is very raw. I also don't like to edit very much. So there's some interesting adult language. It's not safe for work at times.
And that is absolutely fine as well. But that's one of the things that was important to me, because of the kind of audience that I wanted to have and do have. So yeah,
fantastic. All right, so we just got a great question come in from Mariska on the Facebooks. Sorry, so I think where you were from.
Oh, you can pop it up on the screen. You clever thing.
Yes, we're doing good.
Okay,
have you got that?
Yes. So Mariska has just started a blog and would like to create a podcast on the same topics. Do I keep my blog and podcast related to each other? That's a really good question. And I don't know if there's any really good examples of people who are doing that particularly well. So I don't as such. My blog posts sometimes connect, sometimes don't. Sometimes I refer to them. And sometimes I've got something I really want to say a lot about, and I will write a blog post specifically related to an episode and then refer to it in the episode to sort of say, you can go and see all of this if you go and read the blog. I guess one thing I would say is be careful that some topics are more suited to discussing in an audio format, and some are better written. So don't try and force them into the medium that doesn't work for them. But otherwise, if you can do that well and find a way to kind of link your audiences back and forth, then that could be magic.
I think another thing is it also depends on the style of podcast you do. So both Amanda and my podcasts are interview style. They're great discussions with people from around the world on very polar topics, but that works both really well for both of us. Well, I find it works well for me, so I won't talk for you, Amanda.
Oh, it works well for me.
But I think if your podcast style was more just you talking, and it also depends on sort of what your niche is as well, I think, in your blog. So for me, Coffee Field Adventure Travel, a lot of that is places I've been and things I've experienced, which, the stories work really well in a 2-3 minute chat setting. But I don't think the big blog posts I've done about hikes in Nepal or going to, try tea in Japan would stand alone really well on a podcast format. I think it would get very dry very fast, but also that'd probably only be a 15-minute or so podcast for me, where sort of my podcast is sort of that 30 to 45-minute span. Yours are about the same, Amanda, from memory?
25 minutes. That's my goal every time, because I think that's kind of an average commute. But that's, I stick to that. But you're right. And also a lot of blog posts often will have a lot of images involved, and the images are, a really important part of the blog post, and, no images in your podcast. So that's another important part to, I don't know. I feel like they can be so different, but if you can tie them together so thematically they work as a whole, then, that could really work.
Yeah. But look, it could be a really interesting way to craft a whole new generation of podcast fans for you. If you can bring it together. And Mariska, keep us up to date. Let us know how you go. Like I said earlier, there's some great Travel Massive Live episodes on starting a podcast and some of the tech needed behind it. So let us know when you've got your podcast up and running, and we can all have a good listen. Which is also really good, is tapping into your current community to get those downloads and the first listens, and more importantly, the feedback. Because like Amanda, you were just saying, you don't curse.
I've got lots to tell you about feedback.
Yeah.
the listener feedback, the community feedback is so important. So, I've never had any of my community come back and say, "Oh, I didn't like that" or something. But what I really notice is what they do like. I mean, maybe there's things they don't like, but they're too polite to tell me. They're very mature and sophisticated. But they all often say things that they really like, and I really take notice of that and think, oh, well, they really like that. Let's do some more of it. And of course, I also very often go to them and say, what topics do you want me to, tackle? What else do you want me to cover? Or if I've got an interesting guest coming up, what should I ask them? They're like an endless source of information and ideas.
And this is all through your Facebook group that you're connecting with these?
Yeah,
amazing.
Yeah. Largely, I mean, sometimes we'll have chats on Instagram or Facebook as Facebook page or elsewhere as well, but largely speaking, it's within the Facebook group. Yeah,
that's amazing. I love it. I just love that, like, you're using the technology to the benefit of your podcast, rather than sort of just ramming content down people's throat, being like, "Go listen to this, enjoy this." You're actually going, "Here's what I've produced. How would you like to do it?"
Yeah.
So do you find that, like, the nurturing of your community on your Facebook group is taking up a lot of your time, or what's your return on investment there?
That's a really good question, and I think the group is so lovely. I would be in it whether it was my podcast or not, and I would just be engaging.
Well, I am.
It's just lovely, and I think. I mean, I would post there once or twice a day, and it's very organic. I don't have a big strategy or schedule for it. I just post stuff that comes across my desk, basically, or pops into my head, because, I've been working in social media for so long that these things just, appear fully formed in front of me, basically. So that it doesn't take a long time for me to produce or create or post content to the group. In terms of curation, like, it's pretty chatty. So there are times when it is, I guess, on the time consuming side, because I really do like to kind of be involved in the discussions and respond and reply. Although, there's a lot of people who will chat, with each other and keep up those conversations. But I think the return on investment is, it's massively worth doing because of, the loyal fans that I have through that, and the way that they spread the word about the podcast. Like, I have a lot of people who will tell a lot of other people, come and listen to this. So I think, well and truly worth it, and easy to do because it's a really pleasant thing to do. It's a fun thing to do.
Oh, it's super fun. Like, it's such a great group to be in. And I keep on reading about it.
Thanks, Jean.
But it's a really good community. Like, I don't see people snipping in there. I don't see people getting passive aggressive at each other, which is just, it's such a good reflection on the podcast and the community that you've brought together, and you've invested your emotional time in nurturing. It takes a lot to do that, and a lot of people do it well for a little while and then fall off the bandwagon, or they just ram that content down, like, listen to my thing, read my thing, enjoy my thing, without doing that engagement. And that just kind of, personally, that frustrates me a lot, because I like to see that engagement going on there.
I think if you have the engagement, then the listening and the consuming of your content happens quite naturally and organically without feeling forced at all. So I don't post anything promotional, except once a week when a new podcast episode comes out. I post it in there, and other than that, it's just discussion and thoughtfulness and I don't know, fun. Like, it's
having a podcast should be fun. I'm actually going to put that out there. I'm having a great time with it. Having personally,
should be fun. If it's not fun, you're doing it wrong.
Hey, there's just been another great question come through as we're talking about engagement and content creation around the podcast. Mirio from Facebook has just asked, I'm going to pop this up so everybody can see it. Oops. Yep, there we go. Where do you get the most engagement when promoting your podcasts? So is there any specific social media platforms? I'm going to put a bit of a lasso around this question, outside of your Facebook group, because we know your Facebook group's super awesome.
Yep, perfect.
And I love them. But where else do you find that you're getting really good promotion? Like, have you paid for promotion anywhere?
So I don't, I haven't really run any ads for the podcast, probably in a long time, maybe in the early days, if I think I did, just to get a little bit of initial engagement. These days, in terms of social media, other than my Facebook group, LinkedIn has become surprisingly useful for engaging with listeners and people clicking through. which is a surprise to me. I would say it outranks Twitter by a lot these days. And Pinterest to some extent, because I use Pinterest quite heavily for my blog, for the written content, and then just naturally for the podcast content as well. But probably my newsletter does the best of those. So I have a little trick when people join the Facebook group. One of the things they can do in the questions when you join a group is to join the newsletter. There's would you like to join the newsletter? If so, leave your email address. It's probably about 3/4 of people who join leave their address there, their email. So I have quite a good newsletter list, and I have a Thoughtful Travel Thursday newsletter, which I put out most Thursdays. Not every Thursday.
I like that, most Thursdays.
I aim to put it out, but sometimes it's Friday before I know it. Like, how did that happen? So then, and you've missed the window for Thoughtful Travel Thursday by Friday. So, so most Thursdays, and of course, I link to the last couple of episodes in there, but also to other interesting content that is really relevant to thoughtful travelers. So I try to keep it like a list of interesting links that you could sit down, open the newsletter, and find a bunch of things you want to read or listen to. So that's probably of those, that's probably the most successful in getting more podcast engagement.
Oh, that's amazing. So I never thought about like tapping into the newsletter community like that. Yeah. And also LinkedIn. I keep on hearing really good things about LinkedIn.
LinkedIn has improved massively over the years. It's now really interesting. It's like Facebook without funny cat videos.
I could start putting cat videos up there for you if you need it.
No, I like the absence. Like, there's a time and a place.
I like the absence of no cat videos. Thank you, Jean. Fair enough. What about featuring on other podcasts? Do you find that generates just, again, because you're tapping into someone else's community, it's a bit like if you're a travel blogger and you're guest posting, you want to tap in to a different audience. Do you find that gives you like some good, I'm going to call it feedback, as in like audience coming back to your podcast? Not the best words.
Yeah, no. There's a lot of good crossover from guesting on other people's podcasts, especially, if you can identify that the audience is pretty similar, because they get to hear you. And if they're already podcast listeners and then they also like you when they hear you, then obviously it's a pretty small step for them to think, oh, I want to hear more of that. So then they go and find your podcast. So that's definitely one of the best ways I've found to grow listenership to my podcast. Certainly in the first couple of years, in the early years, I made a really concerted effort for a good 6 months or so to be on as many podcasts as would have me. And that made a really big difference. And I've just been doing it again in the last, since the beginning of the year, slowly and steadily being a bit more proactive about, finding interesting podcasts to be on. And I get asked to be on quite a few podcasts as well. And all of those help. And it's also just really fun. I
think it's a lot of fun. Just you're sitting around and you're talking with someone and you don't have to worry about the editing at the end.
Exactly. Someone else does all the hard work. I just show up and talk.
Tell me when the link's live. Yeah, it's a lot of fun when you get to collaborate with other creative people in that way. Now, do you find that like when you're doing these collaborations, do you put those in your Facebook group? Like, hey, I was on Jean's podcast, or do you keep that very separate and just maybe does it go into your newsletter?
So probably it would always go into my newsletter. As to whether it goes into the group, it depends a little bit on is it really relevant to the group? Is it, sometimes I'll be on a podcast that might be more like destination specific, and that's not really the kind of stuff that we would put in our group. And so then I feel like it's a little bit, look at me, kind of overly promotional. So I don't do that. So it's a bit of, it depends, I suppose. And if I think it's a good fit, then it'll go in.
So if you think it's a good fit for your community, and that's something that we've been saying like quite a lot, is finding things that are a good fit for your community. And even in the early days, if you don't have a big community, still seeing what works, getting the feedback from the community and accepting it. That for me is going to be something really difficult, is accepting that feedback, because I might not always agree with it.
But that's the thing, like you build this community and you want to do what's right for them. Like, you hinted at the beginning that I'm contemplating a third podcast, and one of the reasons for that is that there's still other things that I want to say. Like, I have lots of opinions that I'd like to share. not all of them fit that community. And so that was kind of the idea, part of the idea behind this podcast. The third idea is that there would be a forum where I could, I want to say anything I like, but that seems, I don't know if that's possible. But anyway, that's kind of thing. So it's not that I'm holding anything back from my thoughtful travel community, but it's not just me. It's bigger than me. It's a kind of a group of people with a common mindset, and I don't want to stomp all over any of that mindset because I believe it all. But there's other things that are, above and beyond that or different to that.
Well, that could just be so damaging to the brand. Is if you go off on tangents and that.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, tangents, exactly.
And I'm the biggest one to go on a tangent. Ranty tangent over here is my specialty, as many of you will know. Another great question we've got from Maria over on the Travel Massive platform is it worth promoting a podcast before releasing the first episode? And do we have any tips on that?
Right. So yes and no. Like, you want to be able to kind of build some hype and so on. But one of the tips I would give is what I've just done with my kids podcast, Taking Off, is that at least have a trailer out there so it is in all the podcast apps so that people can go and find it and follow or subscribe, because you want them to be able to have it in an app, where they're going to be listening to a podcast. Otherwise, it's another leap. They have to be reminded of it again later once you actually have a podcast for them to be able to go and kind of take that step and listen to you. Because I think that's the kind of unique thing about podcasting is that, yes, it's on the internet, but it's not kind of everywhere on the internet. It's not like reading a blog post or something else that you can just click through straight to it. Generally speaking, you've got it on an app and that's the way you'll listen to it. And you probably might not be, whenever I hear about a podcast, I go straight to, I listen through Spotify these days. I go straight to Spotify and hit follow or download an episode or two. And I might not listen to it for another few weeks, but I know it's there and I've remembered it, so to speak. Yeah. So if you're launching something new, at least have a trailer so someone can go and hit yes, download, follow, subscribe or whatever, and then hype it up all you like before you get your episodes actually out there.
Which is how I've done it. Now, would you say, like, what's your ideal kind of trailer length? You wanting to do an introduction, but I know from the podcast that I listen to, and a lot of them are true crime and investigative journalism. Most of them are real teasers. They're real, like, grab you, pull you in. So we're going between 2 and maybe max 5 minutes. Yep. So do you think that's a sweet spot for people to get into the trailer?
Yeah. Something short. It shouldn't feel at all like a whole episode, just enough to give them an idea. Basically you want them to feel, oh, I like that, I like the style, or I like the voice, or I like something about it, and I'm intrigued to know more. So, a simple example with my Taking Off trailer for the kids podcast, it has a little snippets from the first couple of episodes. You get to hear, me and my son talking, and we say what it's going to be about. It's nothing earth-shatteringly fancy, but it gives you the feel for it. And if you like that, you'll probably like our episodes. So 2 to 5 minutes I think is a good length for a trailer.
Yeah, because I think, again, like, if you see that and you can just, as someone who listens to many podcasts, you can just pop it and really get a good feel for it. I'm really big for voice. There's a few, like, true crime podcasts that are done by a whole group of Americans, and it just happens as one of them I just can't stand the sound of. Like, it's just that really funny thing, whereas I'm just like, I'm sure it's great content, I'm sure you guys have done a really good job, but for me, I can't sit there and listen to it for an hour of that.
You have to like the voice. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's the difference between
music. Some music you like, some music you don't like. It's just it's a taste thing as well. That's okay.
Yeah, and it's very different because you go, when I read a blog post or a newspaper article, it's me reading it and I have to listen to me read it. So I would say that is just feel free to go out there and just have fun with your trailer as well. Again, podcasting should be fun.
Definitely should be fun.
Another great question we have from our friends on Facebook, which I will pop up, is where is your biggest audience from, Amanda? And are they local to you or are they spread out? So this is a great thing I will say about podcasting, is if you get a really good host, they give you some great demographics. I'm a data nerd, And
Me
I
too.
have just been loving seeing like who's downloaded it, who subscribed, how long were they listening for, in different parts of the world. It's kind of like
Fabulous.
Google Analytics, but better. I'm going to
It's
say
so
that.
fun. Oh, I'm completely addicted to my podcast analytics. So I can tell you quite precisely. No, actually, I can't tell you exactly now. I haven't done it for a while. I have checked into how many countries in the world it's been downloaded in, because there's like maybe 25 or so countries where it hasn't ever been downloaded, which really disturbs me. But I'm always listing out, if any of my friends are going to be in those places, download my podcast. So basically, I have an audience that's spread really widely across the globe. The largest chunk are in the United States, and then big chunks in the English-speaking countries, obviously Australia, because I am Australian, the UK, Canada, but also really big audiences in lots of non-English-speaking countries. Brazil has a big chunk. I know.
I love it. It's so random. I think it's fabulous.
It's all over. Lots of parts of Asia, India as well. I didn't mention before, but lots of when Spotify really started focusing on podcasts, that's when my audience got more diverse. So I think I assume that Spotify, I assumed at the time, is more internationally used, or I don't know, popular, and they were really pushing podcasts really strongly
They're really
maybe 2 years ago.
and
And
even now at the moment, like
and
Spotify.
still, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And at that moment, that's when my audience really diversified. And Germany, Switzerland, kind of Central Europe, and that there's lots of people there too. And a lot of them are people who listen because A, they like travel, but B, they also like to practice their English. And I'm sorry for my Australian accent in that mix, but so be it. So once I actually noticed that diversity, I made sure when I used really Aussie slang or Aussie phrases that I actually also explained if necessary, because I realized that I was saying some stuff that people would not get. So I'm really lucky, and I really love it that I have people and from across really widely spread, and in the group as well. It's our announcement tagged question is, where are you in the world? Where are you from? And I always get people to answer that as they arrive in, so we can see how diverse the group is. And that's one of the things that makes it so interesting, because if we have a discussion about anything kind of cultural, then there's so many different options and different opinions and ideas. So
yeah, I love it. So I got a question from Matt Graham, who's in Canberra, which is probably the only place around Australia at the moment that's colder than when I currently am.
that's true.
Is which podcast host do you use, and which has good analytics? So I'll let you answer that, because you actually guided me through several options, and I followed your lead.
Yeah, so I use Omni for my host. They're an Australian company, and to be honest, when I started, a friend helped me and put me on Omni, and that's kind of how it began. But I have loved them, and their analytics are really pretty because they have lots of maps, and you can see, the map is coloured in where people have been listening, and it's just beautiful. So, lots of hosts have different analytics, so look around. But that's my favourite is Omni.
So I'm also with Omni. It's a cost to it, and that's another thing to understand, is that there's a monthly cost for this, but the service that I currently sort of get from them and the platform itself was really good. I don't know if any of the Travel Massive podcast team are watching, but we do have a Travel Massive podcast, and they use a different platform that's equally as good. I had a few questions about iPhone versus Android, Spotify versus iTunes, and the really cool thing is when you get a host, and when you're querying your host on these sort of things and asking like what platforms could you be on, a good host will have a simple way for you to connect to them. So Amanda, how did you find like connecting to the different platforms? So
I just had to go through this.
Well,
so initially, oh gosh, I can't remember. Initially, it was over the years we would add them. But so when I just put my trailer up for taking off, I had to go through this again, as you've just done, Jean. So it was very simple. My host has literally buttons where I just press, yes, put this on Spotify, put this on, oh gosh, now I can't, what's the other one's called? I can't even remember the other bunch on that
Stitcher.
list. Stitcher
Yeah.
and
Stitcher. There's another
one with the
weird one that
box.
I
I
didn't
can't remember.
recognize.
There's a
Um,
and iHeart and stuff. But anyway, the
yeah.
only one you had to do a little bit of extra work for is iTunes, which basically kind of connects it to your Apple ID and things like that. But so make sure you find a host that will put it on everything, basically on all the big platforms. I certainly would not suggest only having your podcast on iTunes or only on Spotify. Occasionally people don't, or maybe their hosts don't submit to Spotify. And as I pretty much listen only on Spotify these days. And if I go and search for it in there and I can't find it, basically I just forget. I think, well, I've got enough other podcasts to listen to. I'm not going to go and listen to that somewhere else. So they miss out. So make sure you are everywhere.
And I do know that if you have a host that doesn't connect to Spotify, you can create a content creator account on Spotify and put your RSS feed in. It's just an extra hurdle to go through that you don't want to go through. And the other thing is, I think Google's just released a podcast app as well. I heard
they have had it for a while, but they've been changing it. Yeah.
So again, really good host will just help you connect to all of these and then collate all of the data, which us data nerds really like. I also like having a dashboard that it's all in one place. So whenever Ian does anything on the Travel Massive platform for me, he's like, here, there's a dashboard. I just get really excited. It just makes me happy.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly right. That's what I can see in my stats. I can see what proportion of people listen on Spotify or through iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts and all of that. So that's how I know that I have a lot of Spotify listeners as well as Apple Podcast listeners.
Yeah. And just like if people are thinking about like whether you should do Spotify or iTunes, Spotify have just dropped something like 100 million on Joe Rogan on signing him up. So they are really pushing some big money behind podcasting and getting excellent user engagement on their platforms. Sorry, not these platforms, but I would say just do both because it's easy.
Don't choose. Do whatever. Put it everywhere.
It doesn't cost you anything. Oh, that's another thing I'd like to say. Once you have your host and all your gear and all that set up, getting on all their different platforms is free. Like you don't have to worry about paying per download or per subscriber. Not yet. And I can't see that happening because a lot of it is, Spotify, if you get the premium, the user's paying for that anyway. So another thing that Maria said is she uses Simplecast, which looks really good. So it's another option if people are out there wondering what they could use. Birdie, my podcast is called Travels from the Kitchen Sink. And that's literally where I record a lot of my conversations because I stress bake a lot. And I'm also one of those people that uses every pot and pan in the kitchen. I don't have a dishwasher and I don't have anyone else that helps me with the dishes because I have to be an adult and clean up my own mess.
So instead of cleaning up your own mess, you stand there and podcast instead.
Yep, pretty much. And then just totally choose that. What happened to that sourdough bread? What did I do wrong? Because I've joined the cult of sourdough bread making. Me and the chickens.
Yeah, you and the chickens. I know. I'm not sure why we're still friends, Jean.
Yeah, because I have chickens. That's why, Amanda. And we have podcasts. All right,
we always have podcasts.
We always have podcasts and a trip to Bangkok. One thing I'm just going to touch on really quickly is because people have asked that leading up to this session was about using either a platform like Patreon or there's a few others that have been released in the last sort of 6 to 7 months that are subscription based. So you can produce extra content for people that are paying you the monies really.
Mm-hmm.
How you've just started the Patreon journey. Yep. And how are you using that to continue nurturing, I don't want to say an elite, but a different level of your community? Like they're paying to hear you.
So I guess I don't see it that way, as in that they're paying to hear me. Rather, they want to support the work I do and the work that they've been enjoying over the years. So I certainly don't. I didn't really want, using the word elite is quite good actually. I didn't want to make it like an elite thing. Like that's exactly, how I didn't want to make the listeners who weren't paying anything feel, we're substandard, we're not as good as those ones. So more it's kind of aimed at people. Like one of my listeners approached me initially. That's why I started to think more about it, because they said it was someone who supports quite a few podcasts through Patreon, and they said, I'd like to support you through Patreon. I was like, okay, let me investigate. And I did look at other platforms too, and because Patreon takes, a chunk of the income in fees, and there's some that take less, but they're a lot less mainstream or a lot less well known at the moment. And I thought for my audience, it was going to be simpler to be something that they would be familiar with. So I went down that path. And so, yeah, some people will produce lots of extra content for their Patreon supporters, which is great. I just don't have the time to do that. So what I do in my Patreon community is give them some extras, which is actually kind of a great outlet for me, in that sometimes I'll record like interviews with people, and we might have an amazing 15 to 20 minute story, but within the format of my podcast, I'll probably only use 6 to 8 minutes of it. But the whole story without, is great. So some of those go into Patreon. Sometimes it's stories that I know I won't get to use for a long time because for various reasons, like, I've got the schedule, and so they get it early. Recently I interviewed an amazing woman who, before our interview, she sent me this list, 15 dot points long. What stories do you want me to tell? And it was like, the time I joined a revolution, the time, all these kind of really outrageous sounding things. It was amazing. And I couldn't decide. And so I put the list into my Facebook group and said, take your pick, guys. And one that was really popular was, I think it was the joining a revolution one. Now I can't remember, but one of them anyway. I put that into Patreon the next day. It won't come on the podcast probably for a couple of months, but that one went into Patreon. So those kind of just bonus little extra things. But really it's just for people who want to video games. Yes, exactly. So it's really just an outlet for people who do want to support and have enjoyed and can afford to. Not everyone can. I totally understand that. So that's really how I've been using the Patreon so far. It seems to be working pretty well. And the people who are so there's 2 levels. There's very thoughtful traveler and extremely thoughtful traveler. And the extremely thoughtful travelers get a postcard, and they're always very enthusiastic about getting a postcard, and I love sending them. So, just
I love postcards. I send them to you. Yeah. I think postcards are amazing.
They are, especially, yes. Yeah. So, so that's how I've been using Patreon so far.
I love it. Patreon's, it's a unique way to engage with a new audience that might not know you, and then to take your engagement with your audience to another level. I love it.
Yeah.
So one last Facebook question before we start to wrap up. Otherwise, you and I could be here for the next 2 or 3 hours.
Forever, couldn't we? But I actually have a podcast interview with a guy in Budapest soon. So, yes. Diverse day.
So good. It's a very diverse day for us. All right. So Mishka's been great with the questions. Loving it. I'm just going to bring this one up. Can you please share your top 3 tips for starting a podcast?
Okay. I will try and keep it to 3. Number 1 tip, consider the boundaries of your content. What's your topic? How narrow or broad is it? And can you think of hundreds of potential episodes that you could have? Because you don't want to start a podcast and find 10 episodes in that you've said all there is to say, or you've interviewed everyone there is to interview. So think carefully about your topic. Secondly, make sure you do kind of find resources to educate yourself reasonably well about the tech to start with. If you're going to do it all yourself, there's heaps and heaps of great stuff out there. And as Jean's mentions, there's even some Travel Massive videos you can look back on as well. So, but do take the time, because you want to start off with reasonable sound quality. Because let me tell you, 4.5 years in, every day, lots of people download my episode 1. And I have gone back to listen to it.
Kind of looked a little bit embarrassed.
Yeah, look, it's not bad. If it was really bad, I would actually replace it, but it's not that bad, thankfully. I sound way more nervous, or, I can recognize the difference, but it's not horrifying. But anyway, people go back to the start of podcasts all the time. So you don't want your first ones to be too terrible, because they will continue to be listened to. So that was 2 tips. Third tip is get great artwork, because you need to have it that people can it stands out, people recognize it. It needs to do a lot of work, and it needs to be sometimes, still recognizable when it's really tiny. So it's worth, if you don't have a great graphic designer friend, do pay someone. Like, it's really worth having good artwork. So that's 3 tips.
Oh, I love it. I'm just going to add to that, and to get really good, interesting music, and to pay for it.
Yes.
So it's probably one of the best tips that you gave me, was you sent me a few links to a few different places where I could actually purchase the music to use, and that to me just, it sets up the tone for my podcast. I find
it's really important, because people will hear that and recognize it as you for years to come.
Yeah. Whereas I think so many people just go, I'll just grab something, or I'll just record something quickly. And I'm like, no, it's just so important to have really good, clear music, and a piece that you could perhaps use throughout the episode as well, if you're going to go to that level of editing. Personally, I don't. I've just got an
No,
in
that's
and
what
an
I've just done with
outro.
taking off, though, with the kids ones. I've got bits of music in between some of the sections, and so that's all kind of different parts of the same piece. So yeah,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
important.
Lovely. So, has anyone got any other questions? We're up to our hour. I'd like to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. It's been great having these questions flow through on the Facebooks and Travel Massive platform. And it's just given Amanda and I a great chance to answer them as they come in and continue our discussion. I will just give one last spruik to, we have a list of podcasts on Travel Massive that when we do the event roundup, I'll have the team add in, and you can find Amanda's podcast there. It's a thoughtful travel podcast. It's not the thoughtful traveler or travelers, as I have maybe said many times to her face as well. And you can find these podcasts. Thanks, Mum. There's a whole heap of different places you can listen to her podcast: Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher. Literally, they are out there on the internet. Go along, give it a subscribe and a listen, and feel free to tell us how you feel about it. Good, honest feedback is needed. All right. Thanks, everybody. We will see you around the place. Bye.
Bye.